The dining room was 40 feet long. 12 people stood inside it. None of them moved. The chandelier above the table held 218 crystal drops. Margaret Holden had counted them once, during a dinner party that had lasted 4 hours and felt like 4 years. That was before the accident, before the chair, before the world had quietly decided that a woman who could no longer rise from her seat was no longer worth the effort of looking at directly. The soup was French onion. It steamed from its bowl at the far end of the table, and the smell of it, caramelized and deep and honest, reached her before anything else did. She looked at the spoon. It lay 3 inches from the bowl's edge. White porcelain handle. Simple. Functional. Unreachable. Her right hand rested in her lap. Her left hand rested in her lap. Both hands had rested in that same position for 14 months. And in 14 months, she had learned that resting was not the same as peace. Resting was simply what you did when the alternative had been taken from you. Mrs. Holden. The voice came from her left. It was soft and careful and had the particular quality of a voice that did not wish to be remembered. Dinner is served. She turned her head slowly toward the speaker. A woman in her mid-40s, the head of household staff, whose name was Deborah, though Margaret had stopped using names some months ago because names implied a kind of intimacy that no one here seemed to want, stood with her hands folded at her waist, her gaze directed at the middle distance just above Margaret's left shoulder. "I can see that," Margaret said. A pause stretched between them like warm taffy. "Will you be needing anything else?" Margaret looked at the soup. She looked at the spoon. She looked at the 12 people in the room: Deborah, 2 junior housekeepers, a personal assistant, the chef who had emerged from the kitchen to receive what he apparently anticipated would be a compliment, and various members of the household orbit who had learned to materialize at mealtimes for reasons that had nothing to do with her. None of them moved toward her. None of them reached for the spoon. There was, in this household, an unwritten rule. She had never articulated it, and no one had ever asked. But it existed the way gravity exists, invisibly, permanently, without need of explanation. The rule was this: Margaret Holden was not to be touched, not to be fussed over, not to be helped in ways that might remind anyone present of how much help she now required. It was a rule born, she understood, not from cruelty but from discomfort. They were not bad people. They were simply people who did not know what to do with a woman who had once run a company valued at $4.2 billion from a corner office on the 40th floor, and who now could not lift a spoon to her own lips. Discomfort, in Margaret's experience, was more corrosive than cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledged you. Discomfort simply looked away. "No," she said, "nothing else." Deborah nodded once, precisely, and retreated. The room began its quiet ballet of non-involvement. The junior housekeepers discovered tasks along the far wall. The personal assistant, a young man named Trevor who was extremely gifted at appearing busy, produced his phone and studied it with the intensity of a man receiving a transmission from another world. The chef bowed slightly and disappeared back through the kitchen door. Margaret sat. The soup cooled. She did not look at the spoon again for a long time. Instead, she looked at the window. It was February, and the grounds beyond the glass were gray, not the dramatic gray of storms, but the dull, patient gray of a season that had simply decided to outlast everything else. 2 acres of frost-hardened lawn, 3 bare oaks, a fountain that had been turned off in November and would not be turned on until April, its basin now collecting nothing but dead leaves and thin ice. She had bought this house in 2009, when the company's second quarter earnings had exceeded every projection anyone had made. She had walked through it once before purchase, had stood in this exact room, and had thought, yes, not for the chandelier, not for the 40-foot length, or the French onion soup, or the 12 people who would one day populate her periphery. She had thought yes because the windows faced west, and in the late afternoon, the light came through them the color of amber, and it had reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, which had smelled of butter and bread and thyme. She had been standing when she made that decision. She would give a great deal to be standing now. The spoon was still 3 inches from the bowl. The soup was still cooling. No one moved. And then the door opened. People who had known Margaret Holden at 35, described her the same way. Always. Regardless of whether they had liked her or feared her, or simply stood in her orbit long enough to feel the particular gravity of her attention. They said, she walked into a room like she had already decided what it was for. This was accurate. Margaret had, in the years between her MBA at Wharton and the founding of Holden Capital Partners, developed the ability to assess any space, boardroom, dining room, operating floor, and hotel lobby within approximately 4 seconds and determine its purpose, its power structure, and her position within it. She walked accordingly. Not aggressively. Not with performance. Simply with the assurance of a person who had decided, some years previously, that the world was navigable and that she was capable of navigating it. She had made her first investment at 22. A small logistics company in Cincinnati that everyone else at her firm had dismissed as regional and limited. She had read their inventory reports on a Sunday afternoon and had seen something no one else had bothered to look for: a routing inefficiency that, if corrected, would reduce their operating costs by 31%. She had written 2 pages of notes. She had presented them Monday morning. Her supervisor had looked at her across his mahogany desk and said, "You're very thorough, Margaret." He had not funded the investment. She had left the firm 6 months later and funded it herself. The logistics company had returned 400% over 7 years. By then, she had 3 other investments, 2 of which were performing at similar rates, and one of which, a medical device startup in Boston, had been acquired by a Fortune 100 company at a valuation that made Margaret's share worth slightly more than most people earned in a lifetime. She had been 25 when she stopped needing anyone else's approval. She had been 37 when the car hit her. It had been a Tuesday. October. The intersection of 5th and Madison at 7:40 inches the morning. A delivery vehicle had run a red light at a speed that the police report would later describe as significantly in excess of the posted limit. Her car, a black sedan, her driver of 11 years at the wheel, both of them following all applicable traffic laws, had been struck on the passenger side. The driver, whose name was Eduardo, had suffered a broken collarbone and 2 fractured ribs. He had sent her a card from the hospital. She had been told about it later, when she was capable of being told things. Margaret had suffered a spinal cord injury at the T6 level. The neurosurgeons at Lenox Hill had explained it to her with the careful precision of people delivering information they knew would change everything. The injury was incomplete. There was sensation. There was hope. The word hope delivered with a particular medical delicacy that she had recognized immediately as a container word, a word designed to hold smaller, harder words inside it until a later date. She had been discharged to the house on the 1st of December, 11 months after the accident. She had been 38 years old, the founder and former chair of a company that employed 600 people, the owner of a house with 2 acres of frost-hardened lawn, and 218 crystal drops in the dining room chandelier. She had no husband. She had no children. She had a younger brother in Phoenix who called on birthdays and had visited twice in the past year, once in January and once in August, and who looked at her, each time, with a specific expression she had come to recognize as, "I don't know what to do with this." She had employees. She had a household staff. She had a personal assistant who was very gifted at appearing busy. She had, in short, everything. And she had no one to hand her a spoon. The therapist she had been assigned during rehabilitation, a woman named Dr. Pauline Walsh, who was excellent at her job and direct in a way Margaret had appreciated, had told her that depression in spinal cord injury patients was common, expected, and treatable. She had listed the treatments. She had explained that isolation was one of the primary risk factors. "You'll need people," Dr. Walsh had said. "Not just staff. People." Margaret had nodded. She had returned to the house. She had said very little about it since. 14 months. The soup cooling. The spoon at 3 inches. And then the door opened. Ethan Cole had been a maintenance worker at Holden House for 6 weeks. He had taken the job because it paid $11 more per hour than the position he'd held before. And because his daughter, Lily's school fees were due in March. And because his car needed a transmission replacement that he had been putting off since September. And because a man with a 7-year-old daughter and a mortgage and no living spouse did the math on his situation every morning while making lunches, and found that $11 more per hour was not a small thing. He was 34 years old. He had dark circles under his eyes in the way that people who are managing well but not quite enough always do, not from hopelessness, but from the specific arithmetic of a life that required more than it returned. He made good coffee. He fixed things with his hands in a careful, unhurried way. He was the kind of person who remembered where he'd set down a tool and never blamed it when he couldn't find something. His wife, Claire, had died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by September. The swiftness of it had been its own kind of cruelty, not the drawn-out cruelty of a long illness, which at least permitted preparation, but the accelerating cruelty of a thing that moved faster than understanding. He had taken 3 months off work after. He had returned because Lily had asked when he was coming back, and he had realized, listening to her ask it, that coming back was not something he was doing for himself. Lily was 7. She had her mother's eyes, a particular shade of gray-green, that changed depending on the light, and her father's stubbornness, which she deployed with a cheerfulness that made it nearly impossible to be frustrated by. She loved 2 things with equal and absolute conviction: horses, which she had never owned and would not for many years, and books about horses, of which she had accumulated 40, and counting. She kept 3 on her nightstand at all times, and read them with a flashlight after bedtime, which Ethan knew about and had decided not to address. The household had no policy on children of staff, exactly. But it had no prohibition either. Ethan had, on 3 occasions when school had been canceled and his regular sitter unavailable, brought Lily with him. She was quiet in the way that children who have learned to read early are often quiet. She observed things carefully and asked questions about what she observed, and her questions were almost always the kind that required a real answer. She had been in the house twice before today. She had not met Mrs. Holden. On the 3rd occasion, a Thursday in late February, Ethan was replacing a section of baseboard in the east hallway when Lily, who had been sitting on a drop cloth with a horse book and a bag of pretzels, stood up and wandered toward the sound she had been listening to for the past 20 minutes. She had heard, from the east hallway, the sound of a dining room where nothing was happening. This was the thing about Lily. She had a particular attunement to wrongness, to the specific texture of a silence that was not peaceful but held. She had been this way since she was small. She noticed when the milk was about to turn. She noticed when her father was tired in the way that meant more than tired. She noticed when something was missing. She walked down the hallway toward the dining room door. Ethan heard her footsteps go quiet. He was 3 minutes into the baseboard section, his back to the hallway, and for a moment he did not register the silence as significant. Lily often stopped to look at something. A picture on the wall, a particular floor tile, the way dust moved in a shaft of light. He finished driving the nail and listened. Too quiet. He stood up. The dining room door was 12 feet away. It was the kind of door that communicated its own importance. 10 feet tall, dark walnut, with hardware that cost more than Ethan's monthly grocery budget. It stood 3 inches open. He walked toward it and looked through the gap. What he saw first was the woman in the wheelchair. She was at the head of the table. She was 38. Younger than he'd somehow expected, with silver-streaked dark hair cut close, and a face that would have been described as composed if you did not look at her hands, which were pressed flat against her thighs with a stillness that was not quite calm. In front of her, a bowl of soup. Beside it, a spoon. Between the spoon and her hand, approximately 3 inches, and a distance that was, clearly, everything. What he saw second was Lily. His daughter was standing beside the woman's wheelchair. She had come from the side entrance, apparently, having found the door open, or having opened it herself, which was also possible. She was holding her horsebook against her chest with both arms, the way she held things she was thinking about, and she was looking at the woman with an expression of frank, unhurried attention. The 12 people in the room, the staff, the periphery, the ones doing the careful work of not being involved, had not yet addressed his daughter. They had noticed her. There was a quality of collective held breath. Ethan's hand was on the door. He watched. "Are you hungry?" Lily's voice was matter of fact. Not loud. The kind of voice that carried, because it wasn't competing with anything. The woman in the wheelchair looked at her. The look was, Ethan would think about this later. At night, when Lily was asleep and he was doing the dishes, the look was not unwelcoming. It was something else. It was the look of a person who has not been addressed directly in some time and has forgotten, slightly, what to do with it. "The soup is getting cold," Lily said. She looked at the bowl. She looked at the spoon. She looked back at the woman. "Can't you eat it?" The room did not move. "No," the woman said. After a moment, "I can't." Lily considered this. She looked at the woman's hands. She looked at the spoon again. She set her book down on the table, with the precise efficiency of someone clearing a workspace. "I'll do it," she said. She picked up the spoon. Ethan pushed the door open. "Lily," he said, quietly, which was the tone he used for "stop what you're doing" that still had the texture of a question. His daughter looked at him. Then she looked at the woman in the wheelchair. Then she looked at the soup. "Dad," she said, "the soup is cold." This was Lily's particular form of argument, not defiance, exactly, but a prioritization of the observable. "The soup is cold" was not a statement about feelings. It was a statement about a problem that could be addressed. She had gotten this from him, probably, and he recognized it even as he stepped into the room and felt the weight of 12 sets of eyes shifting toward him with an expression that was very nearly relief. He stopped. He looked at the woman. She was watching Lily. Her hands were still flat against her thighs. There was something in her expression that was, he couldn't name it precisely. Not quite surprise. Not quite gratitude. Something more careful than either of those things. Something that had been approached from a long distance. "Mrs. Holden," Ethan said, because he had learned her name in the way that all employees learned the names of the people they worked for, through a combination of posted directories and careful attention. "I'm sorry, I'll take her." "No." The word was quiet, not sharp, not soft, just present. "No," Mrs. Holden said again, and this time she was looking at him rather than at Lily. "Let her." Lily, who had been waiting with the patience of a person who has already made a decision, dipped the spoon into the soup. It was not a performance. There was no ceremony to it. She simply leaned forward slightly, brought the spoon to Margaret Holden's lips, and waited. The woman opened her mouth. The room made no sound. Lily refilled the spoon. Ethan stood in the doorway. He had not moved, he realized, since the first spoonful, and watched his daughter feed a woman she had known for 40 seconds, with the same focused, unhurried attention she brought to her horse books and her after-bedtime reading, and the specific arithmetic of a 7-year-old who had decided that something mattered and was doing it. The soup was almost gone before anyone in the room exhaled. Margaret Holden did not cry then. She waited until Lily was refilling the bowl's last spoonful, until the spoon scraped gently against porcelain, until Lily looked up with the satisfied expression of a completed task. "That was good, right?" Lily said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." Then she looked toward the window, and in the reflection of the glass, in the gray February light, Ethan saw the tears. She did not change all at once. This is the important thing to understand about Margaret Holden, about who she was and how she moved through the world even now, even in the chair. She was not a person who did things all at once. She made decisions through accumulation, through the slow layering of evidence until the weight of it became undeniable. She had always been this way. It was why her investment decisions were so rarely wrong. She waited until she had more than enough reason to act, and then she acted completely. The night after the soup, she lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of her bedroom was 16 feet high, coved at the corners, painted the particular shade of off-white that interior designers called warm ivory, and that looked, in the dark, the same as every other ceiling she had looked at in the past 14 months. She did not sleep immediately. She lay and thought about Lily. There was a category of experience that Margaret had never been especially good at quantifying, which was the experience of being handled with gentleness by someone who had no reason to be gentle. In her professional life, gentleness had generally been a precursor to something else, a negotiation tactic, a softening maneuver before a difficult ask. She had learned to read it that way. She had learned to wait for what came after. Lily had picked up the spoon because the soup was cold and someone should eat it. That was the whole of it. There was no calculation behind it. There was no after. Margaret was 38 years old and could not remember the last time someone had done something for her that had no after. She did not sleep until past 2 in the morning. When she did, she dreamed about the logistics company in Cincinnati, which she had not thought about in years. Over the following 2 weeks, she began to ask questions. Not of Deborah, not of Trevor, her personal assistant, who was still very gifted at appearing busy. She asked of Ethan, who came through the east hallway every Tuesday and Thursday to check on the baseboard work and several other maintenance items that the house, being old and large and full of the small failures of aging, produced steadily. She asked him questions the way she had always asked questions, in her working life directly, without preamble, expecting a real answer. "Your daughter," she said one Thursday. "What's her name?" "Lily," he said. "How old?" "7. Pause. Her mother?" He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, she had the sense he had answered this question before and had found a way to answer it that was honest without being performed. She passed 22 months ago. Margaret looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said. It was, she thought, a strange comfort, the plainness of it. No one in her household ever said thank you to her, "I'm sorry." They said things like, "You don't need to apologize," or "We're all doing the best we can," phrases that were meant to be comforting, and instead had the effect of gently pushing away the discomfort rather than allowing it to simply be there. Ethan Cole said thank you the way you said it when someone had given you something. She thought about that for 2 days afterward. The next Tuesday, Lily came again. She did not immediately go to the dining room. She was, apparently, under new instructions. She sat in the east hallway with her horsebook and her pretzels, and she waved at Margaret when Margaret's wheelchair moved past the hallway entrance. Margaret stopped. "What are you reading?" she said. Lily held up the book. The cover showed a gray horse mid-gallop. "It's about an Andalusian," Lily said. "They're from Spain." "Did you know they used to carry kings?" "I didn't," Margaret said. "They're very dignified," Lily said. She said dignified with the careful emphasis of someone who had recently added a word to their vocabulary and was making sure it worked in context. "I want one." "Do you?" "I probably can't have one," Lily said, with the practical equanimity of a child who has already done the math on this. "They're expensive." "But I like knowing about them." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "That's not a bad way to be," she said. Lily nodded. She went back to her book. Margaret continued down the hallway and then stopped at the far end. She did not turn around. She sat there for a moment, looking at the wall, which had a watercolor painting on it that she had bought in Vienna in 2004 and had not really looked at since. The painting was of a field. The field was unremarkable. She had bought it because the light in it reminded her of something she couldn't name. She turned the chair and came back. "Lily," she said. The girl looked up. "The library is the third door on the right past the staircase. It has books about horses, real ones. You're welcome to use it while you're here." Lily stared at her. "Real ones?" she said. "Equestrian reference. Breed histories. Some illustrated." Margaret paused. "I bought them some years ago for a project that didn't materialize." "They've been sitting." Lily was already on her feet. "The pretzels stay in the hallway," Margaret said. But Lily was already past the staircase, and whether she had heard was not entirely clear. Margaret went back to the sitting room. She sat by the window where the afternoon light came through the color of amber, and she thought about a 7-year-old who liked knowing about things she couldn't have, and she thought about her grandmother's kitchen, and she thought about standing. It began with hands. Ethan had been a physical therapy aide for 2 years before he'd left the field. This was not something he'd mentioned. He mentioned it, finally, on a Wednesday in early March. Because Margaret had asked him carefully, as she asked everything, through the slow approach of accumulated evidence, whether he knew anything about range of motion exercises. He had been quiet for a moment. "Some," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she was deciding about. "The physiotherapist comes twice a week," she said. On the other days, I don't do anything. I've been not doing anything. He understood what she was saying. Do you want to change that? He said. I want to try, she said. I'm aware of the distinction. So they began. It was not dramatic. There was no music, no montage, no moment of sudden revelation. There was a woman in a wheelchair and a man who had learned, some years previously, how to help a body remember itself. And there was the careful, incremental work of doing something every day that you could not yet do well. The first session lasted 12 minutes. He moved her fingers through their range slowly, attentively, watching her face for the signals she had not yet learned to give verbally. He applied gentle pressure to her palms. He guided her wrists through small rotations. At the end of it, she was tired in the specific way that very small things can make you tired when the small things are also enormous. Same time Thursday? He said. Yes, she said. He worked through the gentle resistance exercises her physiotherapist had recommended, but that she had not been consistent in performing because performing them alone, in the silence of her bedroom, with no witness and no purpose, had felt like a private humiliation. There was, she had come to understand, a meaningful difference between suffering witnessed and suffering unwitnessed. Not that she wanted pity, she did not, but there was something about the presence of another person that transformed effort from an embarrassment into simply a thing being done. Tell me when it's too much, he said. I'll tell you, she said. And she did. She was not stoic in the performative way he might have expected. She was precise. She told him when something was wrong, and when something was right, and when something was, unexpectedly, not as wrong as it had been the week before. There was a Thursday in mid-March, when her left hand, which had been the less responsive of the two, closed slowly around the handles of the parallel bar they had brought in. It was not a strong grip. It would not have held anything of weight, but it was a grip, and Margaret looked at it for a long moment, with the expression of a person recalibrating something they had revised downward. That's new, she said. Yes, he said. She did not make anything more of it. She continued the exercise, but when Ethan went home that evening and was making dinner a pasta, Lily had requested with the specificity of a restaurant patron, with the particular sauce from the jar with the green lid, not the red one. He thought about the grip, and thought about what it meant to watch someone return to themselves incrementally, the way a tide comes back not with drama but with persistence. Lily, during these sessions, sat in the corner of the sitting room. She had, since the discovery of the library, migrated her reading time there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but she always came to the sitting room for the exercise sessions, as though she understood, without being told, that these required an audience of a particular kind. She drew horses in the margins of her notebook. She looked up at intervals. Once, she looked up and said, "You're doing good, Mrs. Holden." "Thank you, Lily. My dad says if you do something every day, it gets easier." She paused. "He also says sometimes it doesn't get easier, but you get stronger." "So either way," Margaret looked at her. "Your father says that?" Lily nodded and returned to her horse. Ethan did not look up from the exercise he was guiding, but Margaret saw, from the corner of her eye, the particular stillness of a man trying not to show that something had landed. She filed this away. She filed most things away. It was how she had operated for 15 years in rooms full of people who thought they were not being observed. She would keep filing things away, and she would keep doing something with what she found.